In this session, we're going to consider the basic question of the sanctity of human life. I think we've all been involved in discussions and debates and arguments where very soon after the debate begins, it degenerates by getting led off the track down a rabbit trail somewhere into a desultory region or to a manifest irrelevance, or what we might call in the field of logic a non sequitur, where we lose sight of the central point that is in issue or in focus for the debate and get lost in tangential matters. I remember again as a student in my university days when we were studying logic, we were given as an example of such an intrusion of non sequitur of what might happen if a person is on trial in the court and is charged with murder. And in the progress of the trial, the prosecuting attorney stands up and gives an impassioned speech about what a heinous crime murder is, which is obviously irrelevant to the case that must be decided by that jury. The jury's task in such an event is not to determine whether or not murder is a serious crime. The state has already established that and has enacted legislation. What is to be determined in the courtroom in the context of a trial is whether or not the particular person who is accused of the crime is guilty or innocent, and all the harangue about how bad murder is irrelevant. It is relevant, however, if the person is found guilty and there is a subsequent hearing to determine the sentence. Then, of course, the consideration of the gravity of the crime is very much to the point. Now, having said that, I want to alert you at the outset that when we consider the broad question of the sanctity of life, I am not introducing that in order to prove to you that abortion is murder or that abortion is an awful thing. What I'm trying to get us to understand is that the general concept of the sanctity of life has very heavy burden on us when we're considering a question that possibly involves a life and death matter. In other words, if we're not sure that a fetus is a living human being or not a living human being, given our understanding in general of the whole picture of the sanctity of human life, this is an area that is so serious that we must be reminded in the course of our deliberations that we dare not make a mistake here, so that our overall understanding of the sanctity of human life must act as a restraint on us, whichever way the evidence would lead us in the discussion. In the past, I have been involved frequently in the arena of ministering to serious disputes where there is hostility and profound alienation in the labor management arena of our culture. And when we get together in a large room with 100 people who are involved in labor, and mixed in that group we have a few representatives from management, and we sense the anger and the hostility that is there between these groups, if I begin to ask these people various types of questions, do you like the Orlando Magic or the Boston Celtics? They're not all going to agree on which is their favorite. If we ask them how many are Democrats, how many are Republicans, we find a division of the House. How many are religiously disposed or anti-religion, we find a division of the House. We find disagreement on almost every point in the room. until we come to one basic question. It's a loaded question, emotionally, obviously. It's one that no one can answer without feeling. I asked the people, how many of you in this room want to be treated with dignity? How many of you in this room want to be considered as being valuable? One of the deepest desires of every human being is self-esteem. And not just self-esteem, but esteem of other people, that somebody considers us worthwhile. And that's why there's a spirit that ties the human community together. When a crisis becomes obvious, a little girl falls into a well and is trapped out of the reach of the rescuers, and the national television cameras come to Texas, and the world waits with bated breath, hoping and praying for her rescue. Our common humanity screams to us saying, save that life. Because we share a hope, if not a conviction, that human life is exceedingly valuable. Now, when we consider the question of the sanctity of human life, we're doing it because we're trying to get at the larger issue, the core issue that I've already mentioned, the question of, bottom line, is abortion on demand right? Is it the right thing to do, or to sanction, or to enforce? And as I said in our first session, I'm going to look at this question from three distinct perspectives. First of all, from a biblical theological perspective, and then secondly, from the perspective of natural law, and then thirdly, from the perspective of legal or governmental law. Let me begin, if I may, by a very brief, quick overview and canvassing of the biblical perspective on the general sanctity of human life. I think most of us are aware that the origin of the concept that human life is sacred is found in the very opening chapters of the Old Testament, where the creation account of the human race is qualified and explained with the idea that in creation, God stamps His personal image on every human being. In theology, we call that the concept of the Imago Dei, or the image of God in man. So that God creates human beings in His own image and in His own likeness. This does not mean that God creates us as little gods or junior grade deities. We may like to entertain that idea from time to time, but that's not the concept here. We are creatures, we're finite, dependent, derived, and all of those things. But nevertheless, every human being, no matter how corrupt or how virtuous, has that indelible mark of his Creator impressed upon his very soul, that in certain ways he is like his Creator, that he has been given a capacity to mirror and to reflect the very character of God, even though, as I'm quick to add, we are not God. Now, the significance of that is immediately pressed home when the issue of capital punishment arises as early as the 9th chapter of Genesis, where the Scripture gives a law establishing capital punishment in the case of what we would call today in our culture murder in the first degree. Murder that is premeditated with malice aforethought and all of that, in which we have heard this text several times, that if by man's blood is shed, so by man shall his blood be shed. That is not a prediction or a future prophecy, a proverbial insight that would say something like those who live by the sword will die by the sword, but rather the literary structure of that text has it as an imperative. God is saying that if a person willfully kills another human being, then that person forfeits his life and is to be executed. That's the law then that was reiterated at Sinai, where, as we read the several laws of the Jewish commonwealth in the Old Testament, that God says in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, meaning thou shalt not murder. And then in Exodus 21 and 22 and so on, he gives his legislation to deal with punishing those who violate the Decalogue. And so the penalty God enjoins for murder is a capital punishment. Now, if we go back to Genesis 9, the biblical rationale is given. And this, of course, is not intended to be a discussion of capital punishment. That's another issue that divides us seriously and warrants a whole series on its own. But in Genesis 9, the rationale for capital punishment is, as it says, if you shed the blood of man, by man shall your blood be shed, because man is created in the image of God. In other words, what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that God is saying here that human life is so sacred that an attack upon a human being is regarded by God as an attack upon himself. Because any malicious attack on a human being is an attack upon one who bears the image of God. He is an image bearer. And that also means that the dignity that we have is a dignity that doesn't rest on our own preference. You know, some cynical philosophers say the only reason we esteem men is because we are men. And we like to think that we have some kind of value and that there's some significance to our existence. But the biblical message is that man has dignity because God not only creates him, but because God assigns and declares that every human being has value, that every human life is sacred. Now that theme is not just found in the ancient pages of Genesis or in the arcane elements of Mosaic legislation. But ladies and gentlemen, it's on every page. From Old Testament through the New Testament, the overarching message is that human life is profoundly sacred. Just one other reminder quickly comes from the teaching of Jesus in the most famous sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount in the 5th chapter of Matthew. Jesus makes this comment to his hearers. He said, "You have heard that it was said of them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment." Now hear what Jesus said. "But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. Whoever shall say, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire." That's one of the strongest statements that Jesus ever made in his ethical teaching. And what's he saying here? He's saying, don't think that you've obeyed the law of God if you've restrained yourself from committing murder in the first degree. That the deeper implications of the prohibition against murder carries an elliptical, unspoken, tacitly assumed assertion of its opposite. That is, what Jesus is saying here is You are not allowed to kill people, and that means you're not only allowed not to murder them in the first degree, you are not allowed even to be angry at them unjustly. You're not even allowed to hurt the quality of life that they enjoy. You're not allowed to slander them because their lives are sacred. And the idea that the church has always understood in the teaching of Jesus is that what the law teaches in its affirmation, it also teaches in its denial. It's opposite. That is, if Jesus says you must not kill or do anything that's part of the complex of killing, at the same time you are called to do everything in your power to promote human life. To love your neighbor, which promotes the quality of his life. To give mercy to those who are in need of mercy, to give clothing to the naked and food to the hungry and shelter to those without shelter, to visit the imprisoned. All of that is part of the complex of the law of the sanctity of life. That's the driving force behind the whole ethic of Jesus, that all of life is sacred. So it's not simply that you're not allowed to murder, you can't hate, you can't be angry without cause, and so on. Well, let's turn then from the biblical and theological overview in the brief time that we have and consider for a moment if we can learn anything from natural law or from science about the sanctity of life. Now, when we talk about natural law, we usually think of natural law in two dimensions. That is, there are two sources from which we gather the information that we call or subsume under the heading of natural law. The first is what's called technically the jus gentium, or the law of the nations. Sociologists, anthropologists examine the individual law codes of various and sundry cultures spread out over all of the world. Sophisticated cultures, animistic, primitive cultures. What kind of laws are enacted in the East, what kind in the West. And we look at the international scope of things, and we see that virtually every society, at some point or another, develops laws protecting human life. Yes, there have been societies that have certainly allowed for abortion and even infanticide and so on. But the general consensus of the nations is that it is wrong to murder and it is right to promote human life. We look to the philosopher Immanuel Kant's notion of the categorical imperative, and without getting into the technical dimensions of that philosophical consideration, Kant was saying that every human being is born with a sense of duty, what Kant called a sense of oughtness, a categorical imperative, such a profound sense of duty that binds the conscience. And Kant said it's not limited to religious people, to Jewish people, or Muslim people, or Christian people, but to people, wherever they are. And when we're talking about natural law on the question of the sanctity of life, we're talking not about a private, individual conscience, ladies and gentlemen. We're not even talking about a national conscience. We're talking about an international conscience. Something that comes out of the very wellspring of our common humanity, that we abhor murder. Now again, I didn't say that the universal consensus is that we abhor abortion. I said that we abhor murder. I want us to keep our eyes on the issue here. I've already said that the vast majority of those people who favor abortion do not do so because they consider it murder. The general law of the nations is that murder is wrong. The second way we look to discover natural law is at science. And one of the principles that we find in biology has been called through natural lawyers the principle of self-preservation. And this can be seen in many, many ways. There is an obvious, apparent, universal struggle for life and struggle against death in the biological world. I think, for example, of some of the insights of Charles Darwin when he first developed his theories on the origins of the species. He didn't like the word evolution, by the way. He was looking at the question of how variations occur in history. And he articulated his concept of natural selection and noticed that certain creatures have an uncanny ability to adapt to their environment, while other varieties pass out into extinction. In fact, it's been argued by modern science that 99% of all of the varieties of living things that have ever been on this planet are now extinct. And one goes out and another one comes in. Well, how does this work? Well, I can't get into all of the genetics and hybridization processes and all that right now. But one of the insights that we get from the biologists I can illustrate by a case of moths that were found in England. There were moths that's natural habitat was in this woods right outside of the city limits of a town in England. And the scientists examined the variety of moths, and the vast majority of them were an off-white color, sort of tannish brown. There were a few that were more white, and even fewer, a very tiny minority of variety of moth that was jet black. And then something happened that dramatically changed their environment. A factory was built in the town. And the factory, in its process of manufacturing things, was belching smoke daily out of these giant smokestacks, and this smoke was not purified by the modern methods and so forth, air cleaners and anti-pollutant legislation. This black smoke would just come out of the smokestacks and just willow across the city and penetrate the deepest recesses of this forest on the outskirts. And after this had gone on for a few while, the scientists go out in the forest and they notice that the colors of the trees and the underbrush and the foliage in there had changed dramatically. From off-white, light tan trees, they all had this cover of soot from the smoke. And then when they examined the moths, they found that now the vast majority of the moths were black rather than tan or white. Why? Is it because all of a sudden the tan ones turned black? No. I say what is going on here in this natural process of adaptation to environments involves the fundamental struggle for survival long enough to be able to reproduce. And if the white, or excuse me, if the white or the tan moths now have lost their protection of the background, the predators kill them, their natural enemies consume them before they are able to reproduce. And now the black moths that before were clearly visible to any predator now become well hidden. They live longer, they reproduce themselves, and they take control. I'm trying to say that that illustrates this drive in nature itself for life, for reaching that point where one is able to reproduce. Going back to the biblical lesson, let me remind you that the number one, the very first law that God ever gave to his creation was what? Be fruitful and multiply. A law of reproduction. Look at human reproduction itself. I was speaking to an OB gynecologist a few weeks ago, and I was asking him about some of the details of how the human reproduction process takes place, and he said, you know, it's an amazing thing in the process. For fertilization to take place, the woman delivers one egg. And then when the sexual reproduction process continues, in ejaculation, the male sends now 30 to 60 million sperm. It only takes one to fertilize that egg. But you ever wonder why nature undergoes a process where you produce one target and 30 to 60 million bullets to hit it? Huh? It may sound at the outset as a monumental waste of bullets. Okay? But think how many times 60 million are released and fertilization doesn't take place. And if one sperm does penetrate that egg and fertilizes that egg, then there's a certain percentage of fertilized eggs that fail to implant themselves in the wall of the uterus. And of those who do make it to the level of implantation, there is a certain percentage of those that suffer natural miscarriage or abortion. And so it seems as though Mother Nature, or Father God, however you look at it, has so loaded the gun to ensure human reproduction that it has gone to extravagant means to ensure the production of a human life. That's what we mean by evidence from science of the law of self-preservation, that we have been equipped with nature to such a degree to overcome the barriers and obstacles for the reproduction of the human race. Finally, we consider the legal or the governmental view of the sanctity of life. We are told in the most rudimentary of our national documents that we hold certain truths to be self-evident. Don't even need to argue them. They're self-evident. They're what Descartes called clear and distinct ideas. Ideas that are so plain, so manifest that one doesn't have to have a degree in philosophy to recognize them or to discern them. And our government has taken a position, taken a stand on this legally, that there are certain truths that we regard to be self-evident and that we understand that we have been given by our Creator certain inalienable rights as an endowment, a gift from our Creator, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't know whether the forefathers of this nation structured those most foundational self-evident principles in that particular order for a reason or if it was purely literary. But it sure sounds like a hierarchical series of them. Life is first. Liberty, happiness. Doesn't mean that if we want to be happy and we have to kill another human being to do it, that gives us an inalienable right to do it. But the most fundamental right, according to the law of the United States of America, is the right of life. And that's the one that we're concerned about in this discussion. Now, as I said repeatedly, I think everybody on all sides of this issue agrees, for the most part, that there is a special dimension, sanctity, value to human life. We are not barbarians. But as I said also, to prove that life has value or even that life is sacred does not ultimately answer the question of abortion. And I agree with that. But here's what it does do that I think is crucial, and that's why I've taken the time to develop this side of the question, is that it says something very, very important about the question of the burden of truth and the burden of proof. When we are talking about something that may or may not be living human persons, we know we are talking about something that is at the very minimum potential human life. It is of the complex of human life. and we're not exactly sure whether it's actual life or merely potential life, I urge you to consider that the burden of proof is on the one who says it isn't an actual life. Because, ladies and gentlemen, before we pick up a sword and enter into a military war, we better not be saying, my country, right or wrong, my country. Because my country may be wrong. My country may do what Germany did and introduced a concept of genocide. And just because it's my country can do the wrong thing, and that does not excuse me to pick up a sword and kill an innocent person. Before you pick up a sword to kill a human being, you better know that you're doing it in a just cause. And before you hire a surgeon to take a knife in his hand and to destroy an unborn human embryo, I hope you are absolutely sure that this is not a living human being. Because life is too sacred to decide it with the roll of a dice. We need better grounds than my preference, my convenience, or my economic condition before we decide on a matter this serious. In our next discussion, we will look at the question of the origin of human life.